The throne room of Hareth Prime had been designed by someone who understood that power was, at its core, a matter of geometry. The ceiling rose 40 meters above the polished obsidian floor, its vaulted arches threaded with bioluminescent filaments that shifted between deep amber and cold blue depending on the hour, and, some whispered, the queen's mood. The walls were lined with the seals of every system that had bent the knee to Hareth in the last 3 centuries, each one rendered in pressed starstone, a material that cost more per gram than a mid-tier mercenary earned in a year. The room had been built to make people feel small. It was extraordinarily good at its job. Queen Camilla had stopped feeling small in it approximately 27 years ago. Now she simply felt tired, which was worse, because tired was harder to weaponize. She sat at the elevated signing table rather than the throne itself. The throne was for audiences, for declarations, for the theatrical machinery of governance. Contract reviews did not warrant the throne. Contract reviews warranted the table, the low chair with the back support she had quietly requested after her 48th birthday, and the particular pen she preferred, which was unremarkable in every way except that it had never once run dry at an inconvenient moment. She valued this in a writing instrument above almost all other qualities. Soren stood 2 steps to her left, as he always did, holding the secondary ledger and wearing the expression of a man who had made peace with the fact that his life had become a series of standing appointments. He was 61 years old, had advised 3 separate administrations, and possessed a quality rare among political survivors. He was genuinely, almost heroically, uninterested in anything that was not directly relevant to the task at hand. This had kept him alive through circumstances that had retired most of his contemporaries. It also made him, Camilla had always thought, oddly restful to be around. The clerk, young, precise, recently transferred from the 7th Administrative Division and still visibly impressed by the ceiling, stood at the podium with his data slate and read names in the measured cadence of someone who had been told, more than once, that enunciation was the foundation of professional credibility. The mercenary contract review was held quarterly. It was not glamorous work. Hareth Prime maintained standing contracts with 11 licensed mercenary firms and a rotating roster of independent operatives, all of whom required periodic vetting, assignment confirmation, and the formal acknowledgement of the crown. Most of the names meant nothing to Camilla. She signed beside each one as the clerk read it, the pen moving with the steady, unhurried rhythm of long practice. The first name, signed. The second, signed. The third, a woman out of the Velhari corridor with a commendation notation from the border garrison, signed. The fourth name entered the room and stopped moving. Camilla's pen did not lift dramatically. It did not clatter to the floor. It simply ceased its forward motion in the middle of the second letter of her signature, as though the signal between her brain and her hand had passed through something dense and emerged changed. She was aware of this. She was aware also that Soren had registered the pause in the way that Soren registered everything, without expression, without comment, filed somewhere behind his eyes for later consideration. The clerk continued reading. The commendation record, the station of origin, the assigned operational classification. At the far end of the receiving line, partially obscured by the column of pale blue light that fell from the third arch, a man stood with his hands loose at his sides, and his weight distributed in the unhurried way of someone accustomed to waiting. He was not looking at the queen. He was, with the expression of a person trying to be respectful about it, looking at the ceiling. This was a common reaction to the ceiling. The bioluminescent filaments were doing something particularly elaborate near the fourth arch, cycling through a gradient that several visiting dignitaries had described as transcendent, and that the maintenance technician responsible for them had once described, in a private report, as a firmware glitch they hadn't gotten around to fixing. Daniel was thinking that the ceiling was genuinely impressive, and also that he had eaten nothing since the transit port and that, whatever happened next, He hoped it concluded before the canteen closed, because he had checked the posted hours and the margin was not comfortable. He had her eyes. He had the particular set of the jaw she saw every morning in the polished surface above her wash basin, slightly rearranged, carried in a face that belonged to someone who had clearly never spent 30 years perfecting the art of revealing nothing. He stood in the throne room of Hareth Prime, looking at a bioluminescent firmware glitch with the open, unguarded expression of a person who had not yet been informed that this moment was significant. Camilla looked at the next name on the list. She did not sign it immediately. The Calvary Station Transit Orphanage had a motto printed in faded block letters above the main corridor entrance: "Every child a future." Beneath it, someone had scratched in much smaller letters, "At some point in the facility's 40-year history, eventually." The administration had painted over this amendment several times. It kept coming back. After the third repainting, the facility director had quietly decided that a little institutional honesty never hurt anyone and left it alone. Daniel had grown up reading both lines every morning on his way to the meal hall, and had found, even as a small child, that the combination struck him as more accurate than either statement managed on its own. Calvary Station sat at the junction of 3 mid-tier shipping corridors in the outer Hareth system, not close enough to the core worlds to be considered valuable, not far enough to be considered frontier. It existed in the administrative category that bureaucracies create for things they cannot quite classify: present, functional, and largely ignored unless something went wrong. The station processed approximately 400,000 tons of cargo per standard cycle, and, as a secondary function, housed the children that the cargo routes occasionally left behind. Orphans arrived the way unclaimed freight did: logged, tagged, assigned a shelf. Daniel had been assigned his shelf at roughly 4 days old, according to his intake record, which listed his origin as unknown, his documentation as absent, and his identifying features as unremarkable, except for a small notation in the medical column that read *eyes unusual color, see attached. The attached file had never been located. This had bothered the filing system considerably more than it had ever bothered Daniel. He had been, by most measurable accounts, a reasonable child. Not exceptional, not difficult, occupying the middle range of institutional assessments, with the comfortable consistency of someone who had understood early that being remarkable in either direction attracted a quality of attention he could do without. He learned quickly and retained most of it. He followed rules when they were sensible and worked around them when they weren't, which the more perceptive members of the staff recognized as a sign of practical intelligence, and the less perceptive ones logged as a behavioral notation. He had one friend of particular significance during his years at Calvary, a boy named Pell, 2 years older, who had arrived at the orphanage with strong opinions about cargo manifest systems and an inexplicable ability to identify any spacecraft by engine sound alone. Pell had eventually apprenticed with a salvage crew out of the station's lower dock and sent Daniel a message every few months, each one containing exactly one piece of useful information and at least one observation about the salvage crew's cook that suggested the situation was deteriorating. The most recent message had contained the sentence, "I think he put station coolant in the soup," and nobody said anything because we were all too tired to care. Daniel had filed this under the broad category of reasons. The outer corridors built a particular kind of person. He had become a mercenary at 23, not because he had dreamed of it. He was privately suspicious of people who dreamed of professions that involved being shot at, but because the licensing exam was one of the few credentialing processes in the Hareth system that asked nothing about family origin. The form had a field for it. The field was marked optional. Daniel had left it blank with the easy conscience of a man skipping a question he did not know the answer to rather than one he was hiding. The work suited him in the way that work suits people who are good at staying calm in situations specifically designed to prevent calmness. He was not the most decorated operative on any roster he had ever been listed on, but he was reliably present, consistently effective, and had never once filed an expense report that required a follow-up inquiry. In the mercenary industry, this last quality was rarer than it had any right to be, and was, among certain contract administrators, considered more valuable than marksmanship. He had been assigned to the Hareth Prime quarterly review because his firm's senior coordinator had drawn his name from the rotation and told him, with the weary efficiency of someone managing 12 simultaneous logistics problems, that the capital contract paid well, the transit was direct, and the ceiling in the throne room was apparently worth seeing. Daniel had thanked her, packed a single bag with the practiced minimalism of someone who had never owned enough things to require more than one, and boarded the transit vessel without particular expectation. He had not at any point in his preparation considered the possibility that anything about the proceeding would be unusual. Contract reviews were contract reviews. You waited. Your name was read. Someone signed something. You received your assignment and located the nearest functioning canteen. He was currently on step 2. The waiting had been fine. He had looked at the ceiling, which had delivered on its reputation. He was now in the gentle holding pattern of someone who has completed the interesting part of waiting and entered the part that is simply time passing. He did not notice the pause. Soren had survived 4 political purges, 2 administrative restructurings, 1 attempted coup that the official record described as a scheduling disagreement, and a period of 3 months during which the palace's primary environmental system had malfunctioned, and everyone had been required to conduct the business of governance at a temperature that a visiting diplomat had compared, not entirely diplomatically, to the interior of a cargo hold in low orbit. He had survived all of these things by developing, over decades of careful practice, the ability to observe without appearing to observe and to process without appearing to process. He was processing now. The Queen had paused. This was not, on its surface, a remarkable event. People paused. Pens ran dry. Thoughts arrived inconveniently. Camilla herself had paused before, in 30 years of working beside her, for reasons that ranged from legitimate complexity to a recurring lower back issue she refused to acknowledge publicly. Soren had catalogued all of these pauses and knew their textures the way a navigator knew the difference between weather and something worse than weather. This pause had a different texture. He did not look at her directly. He adjusted his grip on the secondary ledger and moved his eyes, with great subtlety, toward the far end of the receiving line. He identified the 4th name's corresponding body without difficulty. A man of average height, unremarkable equipment, currently engaged in an architectural survey of the throne room ceiling with the expression of someone genuinely enjoying themselves. Nothing about him suggested a political threat. Nothing about him suggested he was anything other than what the roster said he was. Soren looked at his face for 2 seconds longer than strictly necessary, and then returned his gaze to the middle distance. He filed what he had seen under a category he did not yet have a label for and waited. The Queen signed the next document, then the one after that. The rhythm returned, steady and mechanical, and the clerk continued reading names into the formal air of the chamber, with the diligent enunciation of a man who had been told his entire career that clarity was a virtue, and had taken this seriously to a degree that occasionally made Camilla want to ask him to speak faster, though she never did, because the entire structure of governance rested, in her considered opinion, on the principle that personal preferences did not interrupt professional process. The review concluded 20 minutes later. The mercenaries were directed to the assignment anteroom by a palace aide who had the practiced efficiency of someone who moved groups of armed strangers through ornate corridors on a quarterly basis, and had long since stopped finding it unusual. Camilla set down her pen. She did not watch the line file out. She looked at the next item on the day's agenda, which was a resource allocation dispute between two outer belt mining consortiums that had been escalating for 8 months and showed every sign of continuing to escalate for 8 more. She read the first paragraph 3 times and retained none of it. Soren waited until the clerk had gathered his data slate and excused himself with a small bow before he said, at a volume calibrated precisely for the two of them, "Should I reschedule the afternoon review?" But it was not a question, technically. Soren had stopped phrasing things as questions sometime in his 5th year of advisory work, having found that statements with a questioning architecture were more useful. They gave the person being addressed the option of engaging without requiring it. Camilla did not look up from the resource allocation document. No. The mining consortium representatives have traveled from the outer belt. The transit is approximately 9 hours. I am aware of the transit time, Soren. I mention it only because rescheduling would require a reason, and I find that reasons, when offered to outer belt mining representatives, tend to be interrogated. But Camilla set down the document. She looked at the wall to her left, where the seal of the Verath compact hung in pressed starstone, and was quiet for a moment in the way that she was sometimes quiet, not absent, but interior, moving through something at a pace she did not share with the room. Pull his intake record, she said. Soren did not ask whose. From which system? Calvary Station, Transit Orphanage, approximately 30 years ago. She picked up her pen again, quietly. But records requests of that nature require a filing classification. Then file it under routine personnel verification. That classification applies to current staff. Soren. But I will file it under routine personnel verification, Soren said, and made a note in the secondary ledger with the expression of a man who had added one more item to a category he still did not have a label for, and was beginning to suspect he never would. Camilla returned to the resource allocation dispute. She read the first paragraph again. This time she retained the general shape of it, which was progress. Outside the throne room's high narrow windows, the capital spread itself across the plateau in the late cycle light. The transit towers blinking their slow rhythms, the atmosphere processors cycling their quiet breath along the ridge, the city conducting its enormous ordinary business, entirely unaware that inside the room with the 40-meter ceiling and the bioluminescent firmware glitch, something had shifted in the architecture of the day that no one present could yet accurately name. The individual assessment chamber was smaller than Daniel had expected, given everything else about the palace. It had the functional, slightly apologetic quality of a room that knew it was not the main attraction and had made its peace with this. 2 chairs, a low table with a data interface surface, a single narrow window that looked out onto a maintenance corridor rather than the capital's dramatic plateau view, which Daniel suspected was either an oversight or a deliberate architectural choice designed to keep assessed individuals from being distracted by scenery. He had been in enough institutional rooms to recognize the grammar of them. This one said, "This will be brief, this is routine, do not read significance into the furniture." He sat in the indicated chair and waited with the patience of someone who had spent a meaningful portion of his life in indicated chairs. The door opened. Daniel stood, because standing when someone entered a room was a habit the orphanage had installed in him at an age too early to question, and too late to fully uninstall, and then registered who had come through the door and stood slightly differently, which was not something he had planned. He had not expected the Queen. He was reasonably certain, based on everything he understood about how quarterly mercenary contract reviews functioned, that individual assessments were conducted by senior administrative staff, not by the person whose face appeared on the official currency of 7 systems. He had, in fact, seen her face on a transit port currency exchange terminal approximately 14 hours ago, and had thought, in the abstract way one thinks about faces on currency, that it was a good likeness. He was now in a position to verify this personally, which was not a category of experience he had anticipated adding to his record. Camilla sat in the chair across from him with the ease of someone who sat in chairs, as an act of deliberate choice rather than physical necessity. She set a data slate on the table between them. She looked at him with an expression that told him nothing except that she was looking at him, which was, Daniel thought, probably the point. "Sit," she said. He sat. "Your name," she said, though she was looking at the data slate which already had his name on it. "Daniel," he said. "It's also on the slate." There was a brief pause. Camilla looked up from the data slate. Daniel held the eye contact with the calm of someone who had said a mildly inadvisable thing, and had decided that the most survivable response was to not visibly regret it. "It is," she said. Her tone had not changed in any way he could measure. She looked back at the slate. "Calvary Station, Transit Orphanage Registry." "Yes." "You've been operating independently for how long?" 4 years under the current license. 7 years total if you count the 2 I spent as a secondary contractor before I sat the licensing exam. He paused. "I'd recommend counting them. The exam has a practical component, and the practical component assumes experience the curriculum doesn't actually provide." "I'll pass that along to the licensing board," Camilla said, with an inflection so level it took Daniel a full second to determine whether it was humor or a genuine statement of administrative intent. He decided it was probably both, which he respected. She moved through the standard assessment questions with the efficiency of someone who had reviewed the form enough times to have internalized it completely. Operational history, equipment classification, engagement parameters, conflict of interest disclosures. Daniel answered each one accurately and without elaboration, because elaboration in institutional assessments, in his experience, created paperwork for everyone involved and never actually improved anyone's understanding of anything. She asked about the Velhari border incident. It was in his record, a 3-month contract that had concluded with a commendation, and a report that had required what his coordinator euphemistically called some creative language to navigate the formal review process. He explained it concisely. She listened without expression. He had the distinct impression she was listening to more than the words, the way people sometimes listened when they were constructing something in parallel with the conversation, building a structure he couldn't see from his side of the table. "Your station of origin lists no family record," she said. It was not phrased as a question. "Correct," Daniel said. "That doesn't trouble you." He considered this with the honesty the question seemed to warrant. "I spent a long time in a facility full of children in the same situation. After a while, it stops feeling like something missing and starts feeling like the baseline." He looked at the narrow window and its view of the maintenance corridor, where a technician was doing something to a conduit panel with the expression of someone who had found the problem and discovered it was worse than expected. "You can't miss a context you never had." Camilla was quiet for a moment. Outside, the technician said something to the conduit panel that the window's insulation mercifully obscured. "No," she said. "I imagine you can't." Something in the way she said it landed differently than the rest of the conversation had landed. Daniel noticed this the way he noticed most things, without comment, filed away, given no more weight than it had earned yet. He was good at waiting for things to earn their weight. It was possibly his most useful quality and definitely his least glamorous one. She closed the data slate. "Your assignment confirmation will be processed by end of cycle. You'll receive the operational brief through your firm's secure channel." "Understood," he stood. "Is the canteen still open?" Camilla looked at him. "I have no information about the canteen." "Fair enough," Daniel said. "I'll find it." He moved toward the door with the unhurried step of a man who had completed an institutional process and was now focused entirely on the next practical problem. Camilla watched him cross the room. She watched the particular set of his shoulders, the way he moved, the quality of his unhurriedness, which was not the unhurriedness of someone with nowhere to be, but of someone who had decided that urgency was a resource to be spent carefully. She had moved exactly the same way at 22. She still did. The door closed behind him. The room was very quiet. Camilla sat with the closed data slate in front of her and did not move for a long moment, and the only sound was the muffled, ongoing frustration of the technician in the maintenance corridor, who had clearly discovered that the problem was, in fact, significantly worse than expected. She had been 22 years old and the throne had not yet been hers. That was the fact she returned to first always, on the rare occasions when she permitted herself to return to it at all. Not the decisions. Not the machinery of consequence that had followed. The age. 22, which was old enough to understand what was being asked and young enough to believe, with the particular certainty of someone who has not yet been educated out of it, that understanding a thing was the same as surviving it cleanly. She had not been queen. She had been the second daughter of a dying administration, a political designation rather than a person, useful in the specific way that young women of good lineage were useful to systems that needed stabilizing. Her sister Mara had been the designated heir, steadier, more prepared, already fluent in the language of governance that Camilla had been learning at half the speed and twice the resistance. Their father had been ill for 2 years. The council had been managing the illness the way councils managed inconvenient realities, which was to say, by distributing it across enough administrative language that it ceased to resemble what it actually was. Into this a man had arrived. His name was not important now and had not been important then, which was, she had understood even at the time, precisely the point. He had been kind. He had been temporary. He had been, above all, outside the machinery. A navigator on a private transport vessel, passing through the capital on a contract that lasted 4 months and did not renew. She had known all of this going in, with the clarity of someone who has located an exit before entering a room, and had proceeded anyway, which was either wisdom or its precise opposite, and she had never fully resolved which. When she understood what was happening in the biological sense, she had been alone with the information for 11 days before telling anyone. 11 days of conducting the ordinary business of her ordinary political life, attending councils, reviewing proposals, sitting at tables in rooms built to make people feel small, while carrying something that the ordinary business had no category for. She had found during those 11 days that she was considerably better at compartmentalization than she had previously known. This was not a comforting discovery. It meant the capacity had always been there, waiting. She had told Mara first. Mara, who would be dead within the year from a cardiac event that no amount of administrative language could redistribute into something manageable, had sat with her for 2 hours and said very little and then said, with the directness that had always been her particular quality, that there were 3 options and they all had costs, and the question was which costs Camilla could carry. Not which were acceptable, which she could carry. The distinction had mattered. The political situation had been specific. Their father's illness had made the succession fragile. Mara was the designated heir, but Mara had no children, and the council's confidence in the line was already under stress. An illegitimate child born to the second daughter, fathered by a man with no political standing, arriving into an already destabilized succession, would not have been merely inconvenient. It would have been material. Fuel for the factions that were already looking for a structural weakness to widen into something they could use. Camilla had made the decision in the way she would later make most of her significant decisions, alone, at night, after the arguments had exhausted themselves, and what remained was the thing she already knew. She had arranged the documentation through a channel that her father's private secretary had provided without comment, and with the professional discretion of someone who had provided similar channels before, and understood that the transaction required no elaboration from either party. She had held him for a short time before the courier arrived. She did not permit herself to remember the specific length of this time. She remembered the weight, which was slight, and the color of his eyes, which were hers, and the name she had chosen, which was the only thing she was in a position to give him that would travel with him without explanation. Then she had given him to the courier and gone back to the work. Within 14 months, Mara was gone. Within 2 years, their father was gone. Within 3 years, Camilla had the throne and the council's confidence and the stability the succession had required, and the decision that had contributed to these outcomes existed in a sealed file in the private secretary's archive and in no other official location. She had made peace with it. She had done this carefully and thoroughly, the way she did everything, and she had not reopened the question because reopening questions that had been answered at great cost was not a luxury that people responsible for 7 systems could routinely afford. She sat now in the assessment chamber with the closed data slate and the quiet of a room that had recently held a conversation she had not been prepared for, and was surprised to discover she had not been prepared for, given that she had spent 3 decades being prepared for everything. Soren would have the Kelvari record within the hour. She already knew what it would say. She knew because she had written the original intake parameters herself, in the careful neutral language of someone ensuring that a document would answer the questions it would be asked, and none of the ones it wouldn't. She had been thorough. She had been, she thought now, in the particular silence of the assessment chamber, extremely thorough. He had still found his way onto a mercenary roster in her own system, presented himself at her own contract review, and stood in her throne room looking at the ceiling firmware glitch with the expression of a man who had nowhere in particular to be and was making the most of it. The universe, Camilla thought, had a remarkably poor sense of administrative boundaries. The assignment confirmation came through Daniel's firm channel at the 17th hour, as promised, and he read it in the palace canteen over something that the menu described as a traditional Herath grain preparation, and that tasted, in his honest assessment, like someone had described porridge to a person who had never eaten it and asked them to approximate it from memory. It was not bad. It was simply a theoretical position on food rather than food itself. He ate all of it because he had learned young that eating what was available was a more reliable strategy than waiting for something better, and because the assignment brief was interesting enough to occupy the part of his attention that would otherwise have been filing complaints. He had been assigned to the capital, specifically to a 3-month protective detail attached to the palace's outer communications infrastructure. The array of relay towers and atmospheric processors that sat along the plateau ridge and kept Herath Prime connected to its 7 systems. It was not glamorous work. It was the kind of assignment that sounded administrative until you understood that the communications infrastructure was also the thing that, if compromised, turned a functioning interstellar government into 7 separate entities with conflicting interests and no reliable way to resolve them. Someone had decided that the array needed a quiet, competent presence who would not draw attention. Daniel had apparently qualified. He sent his coordinator a confirmation with a brief note that the canteen situation was manageable. She replied within minutes that she was relieved to hear it, and that his expense reports had better remain as clean as his previous ones, or she would find a way to assign him to the Valhari border again, which was an empty threat, and they both knew it, but which he appreciated for its consistency. He was preparing to locate his assigned quarters when the palace aide reappeared at the canteen entrance and informed him, with the expression of someone delivering a message they had been given no context for, that the Queen had requested his presence in the secondary receiving room at the 18th hour. Daniel looked at his chrono. 40 minutes. He looked at the remaining grain preparation. He finished the grain preparation. The secondary receiving room was smaller than the throne room and larger than the assessment chamber, which placed it in the architectural middle range of rooms designed to conduct conversations that were not quite formal and not quite informal, the spatial equivalent of a tone of voice. Camilla was standing at the narrow window when he arrived, looking out at the plateau and the ridge beyond it, where the relay towers blinked their slow, patient signals into the darkening atmosphere. She did not turn immediately. He waited because waiting was something he did well, and looked at the relay towers through the window alongside her without entirely meaning to. "The array," she said, still looking at it. "You've read the brief?" "Yes." "Questions?" "A few technical ones about the Eastern relay configuration. Nothing that requires this room." She turned then. She looked at him the way she had looked at him in the assessment chamber, with the quality of attention that collected more than it spent. And he looked back at her with the straightforward patience of someone who was good at waiting for things to earn their weight, and was beginning to suspect that this particular thing was in the process of doing so. "I requested your intake record from Calvary Station," she said. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "That's an unusual step for a routine contract." "Yes." He considered the window, the relay towers, the slow blink of the signals going out into the dark. He was good at not rushing toward conclusions, having found over the years that conclusions reached in haste required more maintenance than conclusions that had been allowed to arrive at their own pace. But he was also, underneath the patience, a person who had spent 30 years with a blank field where a family record was supposed to be, and the blank field had never bothered him the way people seemed to expect it to bother him. And he had always thought this was because he had made genuine peace with it. And he was now standing in a room in the palace of Hareth Prime, being looked at by the queen with an expression that was doing something complicated and careful. And the blank field was suddenly, quietly, present in a way it had not been this morning. "The record," he said, "what did it say?" "What I wrote it to say," Camilla said, 30 years ago." The room was very still. Outside, one of the relay towers cycled through its signal pattern, the long pulse, the two short ones, the pause that the technicians called the breath, and the light of it moved briefly across the window. Daniel sat down in the nearest chair without being invited to, because his legs had made a unilateral decision, and the rest of him had decided not to argue with it. Camilla watched him do this and did not comment, because she had, in the last several hours, quietly revised her expectations of how this conversation would go through several complete iterations, and a man sitting down without ceremony was well within the current version. "You have my eyes," she said. It came out more plainly than she had intended, stripped of the careful architecture she had constructed for it. Daniel looked at her. The silence extended itself for several seconds with the patience of something that had been waiting a long time and was in no particular hurry now that it had arrived. "Is that a compliment?" he said. The laugh came before she could organize a response to it, small, involuntary, entirely undignified, the kind of laugh that 30 years of practiced composure specifically existed to prevent. She pressed 2 fingers briefly to her mouth as though she could retroactively contain it. She could not. "No," she said. "It is a statement of genetic fact." "Right," Daniel said. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her, with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously, and managing all of them with a steadiness that she recognized with a clarity that was almost physical. "So the assessment wasn't routine?" "No, and the capital assignment, also not entirely routine." "I see." He was quiet again. Outside, the relay towers breathed their signals into the dark, connecting system to system across distances that required the word vast, and then required something larger. "I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do with this." "Neither am I," Camilla said, which was the most honest thing she had said in a room with another person in a very long time, and the honesty of it sat between them without collapsing, which she had not been certain it would do. He did not ask her why. She understood that this was not indifference but the same quality she had seen in the throne room, in the assessment chamber, the patience of someone who had learned that questions asked before the ground was stable enough to hold them served nobody well. He would ask when he was ready. She would answer when he asked. This was not the resolution of anything. It was the beginning of the kind of work that did not have a completion date, which was, she had found, true of most things worth doing. "The Eastern relay configuration," he said eventually. "The technical questions. We can address them tomorrow." "Good." He stood with the same unhurried quality he moved with always, the quality that was hers and not hers and both at once. He looked at the window one more time, at the towers on the ridge sending their patient signals outward into the system she governed, and he had spent his life moving through. The grain preparation in the canteen, he said, at the door. Yes. Is it always like that? Camilla considered this seriously, because it deserved seriousness. The kitchen staff have a theoretical relationship with traditional recipes. You adjust. Right, Daniel said. He nodded once, with the air of a man cataloging a piece of practical information and filing it correctly. Good night. Good night, Camilla said. The door closed. The relay towers breathed. Camilla stood at the window for a long time, looking at the signals going out across the dark, and did not try to name what she felt, because some things were more honest when they remained, for a while, without a label.